Hello everybody, this is Fun Police, and we are back with the final part of the Legion card review. Today we are going to be taking a look at the minor nations, Italy, France, and the brand new Poland. We have a larger amount of cards to cover, so we're not going to waste any time and we're going to get right into it. So we're going to start off with France, and their first card is the 4E Brigade. It is a 3 credit, 1 operation cost infantry. It has 2 attack, 5 health, and deployment gets +1 attack for each non-French unit you control. So this is, I don't think, a very strong card. You have to control numerous allied units in order to get a vanilla 3-drop. I think the most notable thing is that this is that if you make this a 4/5, which requires 2 non-French units on the board, that is the same stat line as the 980 Volksgrenadier, just with 1 more attack and 1 less health. And granted, the 980 Volks is not a bad card, but if the 980 Volks had a condition on it, it would be a bad card. And I think the 4E Brigade sadly just falls into a pitfall where it's just better to run, like, if you want to run like a big vanilla unit, run a big vanilla unit. Don't go into a ally like France and then have to run a conditional 3-drop in order to have a 5/5 on turn 3. I would just play like a nation with good infantry in it, which is a bit of a shame, However, there is maybe an interesting thing in that maybe this is a theme that France will have in the future. Maybe we're going to see more cards like this in like upcoming sets and whatnot, and maybe that will enable this. But for right now, I don't think the 4E Brigade is really anything more than an average draft card, and it's going to need some big support in order to function otherwise. The other card we have is the 9 credit Cross of Lorraine. It is an order, and it says cost 1 less for each card in the enemy hand. Deal 3 damage to an enemy. So this is potentially free damage, which can be quite powerful in the right deck. Most notably, Japan Resistance is a deck that has ways to boost order damage and really benefits from any extra damage they can get a hold of, which just raises their damage limit by a good amount. So this could potentially fit into that list as a tool that is sometimes removal, sometimes burn. It is competing for slots, which is a bit of which is probably the biggest reason it wouldn't see play. But, for example, if you can play this late in the game with like a Kawanishi, it could potentially be 0 credits, deal 5 damage. If you have both of them, that could be 10 damage for free on top of whatever other orders you play alongside the Kawanishi. That's a lot of damage that gets added on top of it. And in a pinch, you can use it, for example, alongside Phony War, and on turn 5, have a 0 credit deal 3, so you have a way to keep the enemy, to remove threats if you really, really need to. I think there's potentially some good flexibility here, and just that combination of it as extra burn and also as removal in emergencies might give it enough of a reason to be run that it actually sees play. Now, granted, I'm not a resistance player that much. I don't really enjoy the deck, so I don't really play it. So I'm not going to try to say that, oh, you should be jamming this in every resistance deck. But I think there's perhaps enough merit there to at least try it out and see if it can hold its weight. Going on from that, we have the Italian cards, starting off with the Canon DA-47. It is a 1 credit, 1 operation cost artillery. It is a 1/3, and it has the text, is dealt 1 damage at the end of your turn unless you control more units than the enemy. Notably, this requires you to have more units than the enemy, not the same amount. If you are tied for the number of units on board, the cannon will deal damage to itself. So if you're going second, this is oftentimes a 1/2 artillery. However, that is still really good. In terms of 1-credit artilleries, most of them are 1/1s or have some very harsh condition if they're any bigger. So the cannon being able to survive stuff like bloody sickles and winter warfares and whatnot can be quite a powerful option. Even as a 1/2, I think it has merit. I guess the main thing is we'll have to see if there is an Italian aggro deck out there. I think the best place that this would see play in is a US Italian aggro deck, because the L60 is a very good way to get control of the front line, and you'll be able to quickly flood the board with cheap artillery and whatnot, and then buff them up with like Greyhounds and other other buffs, and then also be buffing your L6, and you potentially have this very strong combination where the cannons keep the enemy board down while the L6 kills the enemy. On top of that, if the enemy is ahead and you use the L6, you could retreat a 1 health cannon and save it. That's maybe a bit specific, but there is maybe some use there. Otherwise, I guess we'll have to see if there's any decks that are wanting artillery. Italy doesn't have that many artillery pieces, but maybe something like Soviet artillery would go into an Italian ally for some reason. Maybe the cannon's that strong. The Soviets did get a lot of draws, so there is potential. But I think this will definitely have to be tried out in a couple places and see if it can find a home anywhere. Next up is Decisive Defense. It is a 3-credit countermeasure, the first countermeasure in Italy, and it has the text, when a unit attacks your HQ and a 6th Alpini Regiment next to it defending. The 6th Alpini Regiment, for reference, is a 4-credit 3/5 guard with Alpine. And then some important things to note. Number 1 is that Alpine will trigger when decisive defense happens. So if you have, for example, 1 Alpine unit and then the enemy activates this, the guard will come in as a 4/6 instead of a 3/5. And the second thing to note is that this card redirects the attack away from the HQ onto the guard. So the enemy that attack essentially gets blanked in favor of having you essentially fight a guard. So I think this is quite a good card. I think the fact that it blocks the attack gives this card a lot of utility that other cards don't always have. A 3/5 guard is big enough that it can eat most early drops. It can definitely trade out quite well against many of the early game drops that most decks are putting out. And Decisive Defense does that quite well because it's 3 credits for that 3/5, which is, probably is pretty well statted. And it definitely can get bigger if you're running other Alpine units. Although I really don't think you'll be running this in an Alpine deck. So I'm going to consider it mostly a 3-credit 3/5 guard, which is quite well statted. That's a good stat line for the cost. So I think that overall, Decisive Defense has that good anti-aggro utility, but the other thing it has is it's good at disrupting combo decks. Combo decks often are things like, you could say like, the various OTK decks like with Shiden, or like some big combo for big units, or even just like the countermeasure decks. Having a guard that can potentially essentially save you like however much damage a counteroffensive play would have done can be quite big. That could be, a game-winning move if you can time it correctly. And if the enemy... And the other thing is that if the enemy knows you're playing this and has to play around it, there's some serious, things they might have to consider. If you have this activated, are they going to have the tools to deal with that 3/5 and whatever else you have on the board? So it's like not something that they can ignore, and they're going to have to plan the deal with it eventually because it has that guard. So I think this has a good chance of seeing play. Italy is a great control nation, and I think this is just another solid option to put in that deck. But with those out of the way, let's get to the big one, Poland. So we got 20 cards to go over here, which is quite a lot. And they're all roughly divided into themes. I think a lot of Poland is tying together in archetypes that make it important to point out that synergy. So I'll make sure to do that when we go over them. But let's start off with Poland's only countermeasure at the moment, Stubborn Defense. It is 0 credits. When the enemy attacks your unit, give your unit +2 defense. So this card looks like a low value option, which it definitely is on its own. But I do think there is some high potential when you go to combine this with the survive combat units that Poland also has. Being able to give those extra points of health can be highly valuable, as it can potentially, allow them to survive and activate their effects. So I think that is the most likely place we would see this. And those cards I expect, honestly, to fit into a more aggressive deck. So maybe Stubborn Defense is for some sort of very aggressive deck. Maybe something like German Poland aggro, and then you have stuff like Enigma and other high-powered draw in order to replace the fact that you're using cards like this that are otherwise kind of low value. Could be an interesting place for that. Next up is the 5th Legion's Regiment. This is a really strong 1-drop in my opinion. It is 1 credit, operates for 1. It is an infantry. It has 1 attack, 3 health, and it says it gets +1 attack when it survives combat. So the 5th Legions is, I think, really, really strong. This text means that unless you kill the unit outright, it essentially has heavy armor 1 on a 1-drop. That's quite powerful. In fact, anything with 1 attack is just essentially giving this extra attack. I think this is potentially a pretty insane 1-drop that can very quickly turn into quite the threat, especially against decks that try to rely on a lot of 1-attack units. So I think 5th Legions is just a really good 1-drop, and is definitely, I think, one of the core cards in the Survives Combat theme. You start off with just a strong turn 1 play. If the enemy plays anything, it can usually, the 5th Legions will be able to trade into it and then survive and overcome it. If most 1-drops only have 1 or 2 attacks, so they, for the most part, can't kill this, which means it'll often attack them and fight them, gain attack, but also heal, and just keep trading and become a real headache for people. So I think this is really strong. I think this is just a really strong 1-drop. I guess we'll see if Poland has aggressive decks in it, but I think this is a really good 1-drop that can really help enable more aggressive decks. Next up, the PZL P7. It is a 1 credit, 1 operation cost fighter. It is a 1/2, and then it has Blitz and the text, when an enemy unit moves into the front line, retreat this unit. So the P7 is a really interesting fighter because it is the cheapest Blitz fighter within the game. It is able to very effectively, for its cost, it can essentially come down and be boosted up and then hit the enemy HQ for just way easier and way sooner than almost anybody else. And I think that is an extremely interesting part of this card. Obviously, if the enemy is in control of the front line, this is getting bounced back to hand, but that could even be considered an upside, as the enemy is essentially allowing you to save it for later when you can use it with burst in the mid game and kill them out of nowhere. It also has the utility of being able to deal with 1-attack units, and then if they try to move into the front line. So there's some utility there, but I really think its best home is going to be in decks that buff the support line or buffing fighters. For example, maybe British Air would want this as a super cheap fighter to buff. Really get a lot of value out of that close air support without needing to have, units ready to attack or making it hard to block. or having the inability to block with because the enemy has fighters or something. So I think this is really interesting. Also Soviet artillery might want this. I will talk about another card that I think Soviet artillery might be interested in, and maybe this and that other one will fit really well into a Soviet artillery deck. As a lot of extra burn and just backline stuff to buff. We'll have to see, but I think there's definitely that this card is too unique to not find a home somewhere. And this effect is going to be very useful. And I think, honestly, that even if it does fail to see any play, it's going to see play eventually. I don't think there's really a way that such a cheap blitz plane cannot see play ever. Moving on from that is the TKS. It is a one credit, 1 operation cost tank. It is a 1/1, and then it has Ambush and Intel 3. Just as a refresher, Intel, when you play a card with Intel, it would reveal a certain number of cards in the enemy hand equal to the number. So in this case, you'll be able to look at 3 enemy cards. They remain revealed until the enemy either plays them or they somehow get shuffled back into the deck. The TKS, I think, has a couple things going for it. It is one of the biggest Intel cards currently, allowing you to, right out of the gate, pretty much know what is in the enemy's hand. You look at 3 out of 4 to 5 cards in the enemy's hand. Quite a powerful start to knowing what the enemy has. And the Ambush can have some small utility against aggro decks, because there are some aggro units that will have a hard time trading in with their 1 health. I mainly think of this against other 1-drops such as 15th Cavalry and other similar 1 health units. So there's a bit of utility there. I don't think that's a major thing, but it is nice to have. But the biggest thing, I think, is that in combination with Legions, which we will talk about when we get there, but for the TKS, it is the cheapest Intel card, which gives it the unique ability to be the quickest way to buff up your Legions. And I think that may give the TKS a home. You may just want to run a copy or 2 so you can do something with Legions, play them out, and then quickly play the TKS and use them and buff them up to where the enemy is going to have a harder time killing them. But otherwise, I think this is a very interesting card, and I'm very curious if it's going to fit into a Legion deck. I think that remains to be seen, though. Next up is the 7TP. The 7TP is a 2 credit, 1 operation cost tank. It is a 2/3, and it says when this unit survives combat, draw a card. So I think the 7TP is one of the core cards to the survive combat archetype, and is also just a really good 2-drop for Poland in general. We've seen that cheap cards that draw, such as the Japanese Signal Regiment, or Recon Regiment, my bad, the 1 credit 1/2 that when it takes damage draws a card, sees play in practically all decks with Japan, and I think the 7TP is very close to being an auto-include in almost every deck with Poland in it. You get a vanilla statted tank, and if it ever fights, you draw a card. So it replaces itself. That's just a powerful effect. And I think the 7TP is a really strong enabler for the survive combat. It is a draw engine on a cheap unit. Combined with stubborn defense and other buffs, this thing could be drawing 3, 4, 5, upwards of 3 or 4 cards if the enemy can't remove it right away, which is a lot of cards. That's quite a lot of value for such a good, well-statted unit just in its own right. So I think the 7TP is very strong, and it's always going to be. It's one of those cards that I think, if you're playing Poland, you're going to give this at least a good consideration as to whether or not your deck wants it. I think it's that good. Next up is Agency Africa. This is a 2 credit order. It has Exile and Intel 3, and it says add to hand a copy of a random known card in the enemy hand. It is a British exile, so we have already talked about this card in the Britain review, and there I said that for the most part I don't expect this to see much play. Maybe commandos want it because you can occasionally steal other orders and just, double up on the amount of orders. But otherwise it didn't have much purpose, and sadly I don't think it fits here much either. The random order is fine, but it just, for 2 credits, it's not exactly the best thing in the world. Maybe Agency Africa will, just because it is the other Intel 3 card. There's no other card that shows as much besides the TKS, so maybe if you really value looking at the entire enemy hand, this could be useful, and then you just get to steal a random card from them. And maybe there's something there. It's hard to say, but I don't think we will really see Agency Africa a whole lot outside of for fun decks. Moving on from that, we're going to First to Fight. It is a 2-credit order that says give a friendly unit, when this unit survives combat, add a Legions to your support line. So this is our first card with Legions. So the Legions is a token. It is a 2-credit, 1 operation cost infantry. It is a 2/2, and it says guard, and then gets +1/+1 when you play a card with Intel. So Legions are, as an archetype, very directly tied with the Intel mechanic. And a big thing is that the Legions are, with their guard, provides defensive opportunities, while also being able to grow as you play Intel and turn into actual serious threats. So, in relation to First to Fight, this is kind of blending the survive combat with the Legion and Intel mechanic. And I don't know how effectively you can mesh the two together due to the limited core slots. But I think First to Fight is a really good card on its own. This is able to target any unit, which means it is able to be put on an artillery piece, and then that artillery piece can attack for free, and then it adds a 2/2 guard next to the artillery piece. That's quite powerful. And that is, potentially kind of insane. You can have an artillery piece or a bomber that, if the enemy can't remove it with orders, is continually spawning guards. That is potentially insane. And even if you don't want to do it on a artillery or bomber, any decently healthy unit could potentially be summoning several extra 2/2s that, if the enemy doesn't remove, you might buff. So I think First to Fight is actually kind of insane, and maybe one of the best cards in Poland. I think it's that strong. I think there's a lot of decks that will consider it, and I honestly do think that in a survive combat deck, this is another card that you're just going to run because it's, usually I would expect, honestly, to get about 2 2/2s out of this, which is a 2-credit 4/4, and that's just really powerful. So I think we'll see this card a lot, and it may end up being one of the best cards in Poland. Next up is Section 2. It is a 2-credit order. It says Intel 1, and it draws a card. So overall, this is probably one of the weaker cards in Poland. It is quite low impact. Revealing 1 card is minor, and drawing a card is just passable. Usually, we've seen that we've had, cards that do stuff and draw a card, but I don't think this does enough beyond that to really see play. It is just not... It's meant to be, I think, a card that buffs Legion, but you have, I think, better options than this. So I don't expect this to see much play as a card you run itself, although there is a future card that gives this that I think will see a lot of play. So I think you will see this card, but we won't put it in our decks. The 37mm Borphos is next. It is a 3 credit, 1 operation cost artillery piece. It is a 2/2, and it says when an enemy attacks, or when an enemy moves into the front line, deal 1 damage to it. So this is the other card that, alongside the PZL P7, I think could be a reasonable inclusion into a Soviet artillery deck. Soviet artillery benefits from a lot of artillery pieces, which this is one, and that deal 1 damage when it moves into the front line does have a good amount of utility. It can potentially block the enemy from moving 1 health units into the front line, and it also makes it harder for the enemy to trade into your various artillery pieces. The Borphos itself is probably not the strongest artillery piece, but we've seen that this artillery decks are able to run a fair amount of otherwise lackluster artillery pieces, so maybe this, alongside that super cheap blitz fighter, is enough for a reason for the Soviets to go into a deck. Combine that with First to Fight, and that's 10 cards, that's most of your ally slots you have filled. There could really be something there, I think. Add in the 7 TP, actually, and you have a 12-card ally that's generating guards, drawing cards, and then has an artillery and also cheap blitz. That could be quite a strong addition. But beyond artillery-based decks, I don't see the 37mm seeing that much play, unless there are decks that are playing nothing but 1 health units, like Tokens. So if Tokens comes back, this could be a strong tech card, which could be quite useful. Next up is Plan West. This is a 3 credit order, and it says add 2 legions to your support line. So Plan West is, I think, a major card for a legion-based deck. The fact that it is a 3 credit 4/4 guard is already really strong. That is a very solid stat line. And it is spread across 2 bodies, which makes it somewhat weak to AoE, but it also means that hard removal isn't as effective against it, Unlike a lot of other guards, which are often just 1 stat line, this is spreading it out, so if they Amphibious Assault or Sudden Strike or do something else, or they bounce it, they still have another guard they have to work through. On top of that, the legions are can get buffed. At only 3 credits, on turn 4, you can go Plan West, summon your 2 legions, and then play a TKS. And that is, turn 4, you have 2 3/3 guards and a 1/1 ambush tank for 2 cards. And if the enemy is not able to remove them, they're going to keep growing. And that's just, I think, really strong. And I think Plan West is a core card for the Legion archetype, the Legion Intel Poland archetype. It just is going to, the fact that it just summons 2 of them is, I think, the really important thing, because it means that the threats get divided up and it's harder for enemies to remove it over and over again. It's almost like a token deck, but with bigger tokens that are going tall rather than super, super wide. So I think this is a really good card. And again, baseline is a 3 credit 4/4 worth of stats in guard. I don't think you can really go wrong with that. But moving on from there, we have the PZL P11. It is a 3 credit, 1 operation cost fighter. It has 2 attack and 3 health. And it says your exile cards cost 1 less, to a minimum of 1. So this is the only card that cares about exile currently within the game. And it's not an awful one. Getting a discount is useful, but I think the biggest problem is that the current exile cards don't really all contribute in specific ways. For example, stuff like the T-3476 or the IL-2 or Agency Africa or the Spitfire, or even the Battle Mark 1. All of these are fine, but they don't come together into a deck that fits the theme right now. This could be nice, and the exile theme is interesting because there is a way to print a sort of tribal thing in Poland with having Polish cards care about exile, but then having the exile cards go into a main nation. For example, you can run a Soviet Polish deck, and the T-34 and the IL-2 will be Soviet cards, meaning you still have 12 deck slots. My bad. 12 deck slots that can go to like the P11 and whatnot. So for right now, I don't think the PZL P11 is that strong. I think we need to see some more exile cards and maybe another enabler or two for it, but I think it's a good idea. I like that this is a card that is enabling exile to be more than a deck building keyword, that it can matter in game. I think that's an interesting thing, and I hope we see more of that in the future. But for right now, it's kind of meh. Then we have the PZL 23 Kards. It is a 3-credit, 2 operation cost bomber. It is a 2/2. It has Intel 2. And then it says, at the end of your turn, add a Section 2 to your hand. Section 2 is that card we talked about previously. 2 credits, Intel 1, and draw a card. I think this is a very strong enabler for the Legion deck. This is a constant engine that will continually provide you with more intel to pair up with your things. It has intel itself, so when you play it down on top, the legions will not only guard it, but the legions will get bigger, and this is a bomber to threaten. And then on top of that, Section 2 is a very... is not a good card on its own, but when you're getting one every turn, it's useful because it allows you to replace itself, which means that the Kards actually is able to replace itself every time. It's a bit expensive, but you get 2 intel procs, you draw 1 card, and you put a 2/2 bomber out, and the enemy had to deal with it. And there's ways for it to, if it survives ever, you're getting another intel card, which means this drew you 2 cards. So this is both. And this is an engine in multiple ways. It's an engine in that it's drawing you numerous cards the longer it sticks around, but it is also an engine to buff up your legions. At minimum, this is providing 2 different intel cards to buff up, but its potential to provide 3 to 4 or even more if you're really going at it. So I think this is a really solid card and is going to, similar to Plan West, kind of be one of those core foundational cards in the deck of a Legion archetype. Moving on from that, we have the Battle Mark 1 PL. The Battle Mark 1 PL is a 4-credit, 2 operation cost plane. It is it is a bomber, and it is 1 attack and 1 health. And then it is a British exile, and it says the first order you give each turn also gives your units +1/+1. So we talked about this within Britain, and I said in that review that it was probably going to possibly see play in Commandos or maybe 1 or 2 other very niche decks, but otherwise was a bit too slow. And I think that mostly holds true for here also. Although notably, it could be an option in a Soviet artillery deck, maybe. Being able to buff all of your artillery, even just one time, can quickly turn your board into a very quickly out snowballing threat. And this is able to do that. Artillery does run some cheap orders. Granted, you wouldn't want to run war production probably in that deck anymore, but you still would. The Soviets always have Bloody Sickle to fall back on, cheap 1-credit order. So I think the Battle Mark 1 maybe has a chance in some decks, but we'll just really I think have to wait and see where it could maybe pop up. Then we have Daring Strike. It is a 4-credit order, and it says cost 1 less for each intel card you've played this battle. Deal 2 damage to any target. So Daring Strike is sort of a payoff for intel that isn't tied to the legions. And sadly, I think it falls short. It's just too little damage, and because you're having to run it in a Polish slots, I think it just is too expensive for what it does. Not expensive, but it's too low impact. And as such, I think it is probably not going to see any play. The only place I could maybe see it is in a Japan Polish deck. They are able to. Japan has an intel card, and you just got to run a couple other intel cards, and then, if you get this down to 0 credits, late game you play Kawanishi or boost orders somehow, and then you have all of these to just hit the enemy HQ with. But you're trading away France, which hurts the deck a lot, so I'm not seeing it. I think this is probably the weakest card of Poland overall, and I don't see if there's much potential for it anywhere right now, even with future cards, sadly. Next up is the IL-2MPL. It is a 4 credit, 2 operation cost bomber. It is a 3/3. It is an exile for the Soviets. It has heavy armor 1, and it says when a friendly unit with heavy armor survives combat, give it +1/+1. So this is an interesting card, seemingly trying to fit into the survive combat, but that condition to have heavy armor, I think actually pushes it into a very different archetype. And I think that archetype is actually T-34 tribal, or just in general, like a Soviet mid-range deck. The Soviets have Men of Steel to pair with the IL-2, so there could be something there. And I think that's maybe the best place for it. I don't think there's enough pieces in the heavy armor archetype to have this as a strong enough payoff. Although it could get very silly very quickly if it starts sticking around, because it does buff itself in combat. So it can be a ever-growing bomber while also buffing the rest of your board. If we see more heavy armor stuff from like the Soviets, or if we see heavy armor on cheap units, I think the IL-2 could become a more serious card, but for right now I'm not seeing it, sadly. I think it'll be a fun card to mess around with, but I think that, for example, the best place would be the T-34 tribal, and I think that deck is already going to be kind of cluttered for 4 and 5 drops, so I don't think this will make the cut, but maybe I'm wrong and you run a copy or two to better snowball the board. I guess we'll see. Then we have the T-34-76PL. It is a 4 credit, 2 operation cost. It is a 4/4 heavy armor blitz exile tank. It is also a Soviet exile, I should mention. So this is just an overall, I think, decent budget card that fits well into the Soviet T-34 tribal. And for Poland, outside of that specific deck, I think it's an average card. It's very similar, for example, to the Panzer III-J, which is a German 4/5 blitz tank for 4 credits. It doesn't have that one doesn't have heavy armor, so this, I would say, probably trades a little bit better. But otherwise, it's pretty similar. And I think that the only place you would probably run this is if you're looking for some sort of mid-range blitz tank that also benefits from that in a nation that doesn't have that. So maybe like in the US deck, but I don't really know why we would be running that. So I mean, maybe it's a bolster target. It's not the worst thing, but that's also expensive, and they already have a lot of good bolster targets. So I'm not seeing it. I think in the future, the tribal deck will have its best chance. And otherwise, it'll probably just be a good budget card. Now we got Underground State. I think this is, alongside First to Fight, contender for one of the best cards in Poland. If First to Fight isn't the best, I think Underground State is the best, and vice versa. It is a 4 credit order. that has Intel 2 on it. It says send target enemy unit to owner's hand, and then add a legion to your support line. That is just practically everything you could want in a card. You are getting a 2/2 guard. You are using Intel, able to buff up legions already on the board, and you are bouncing an enemy unit. It is notable that the Intel on this card happens before the Legion comes down, meaning that the Legion that this summons will only be a 2/2, which is a bit of a shame. But even disregarding that, this card just is like everything. The Legion deck now gets to run removal. It has extra Intel on top of making more Legions. It's everything that a Legion deck could want. And if you're playing a Legion deck, 3 copies of this immediately. This is just the best Legion. This is the best Legion and Intel card currently in the game, I think. It's one of the best Polish cards. Just everything you could want. Not really much more to say, I don't think. Play it if you're playing Poland, or consider it because it's that good. Moving on, we got the Zaza division. It is a 4-credit, 1 operation cost infantry. It's a 2/5 with Blitz, Fury, and the text, when a friendly unit survives combat, give it +1 attack. So this is a top-end threat for the survive combat archetype, I think. That Blitz and Fury makes it quite scary as a buff target. Able to move into the front line and then immediately next turn threaten the enemy with that Fury, makes it a prime buff candidate. Any extra damage is doubled on it, which is quite powerful as a threat, but it also doesn't even need to move into the front line in order to fight, as the Zaza division instead simply acts as a buffer for the rest of your units. In particular, I think with artillery and bombers, you play this guy out, you attack with your bombers, and they start just getting extra attack. And suddenly your board's a lot scarier, and the enemy still has to deal with the Zaza division. I think it just has a lot of utility in more aggressive Polish decks, or in decks that are running a lot of cheap units. And with the Survive Combat archetype, I think this is the top-end threat of it. And even beyond that, I think it could maybe work its way into like an artillery deck or a bomber deck and just be like a, buffer that also threatens on its own. I think it's a really good card. I think this is a very solid and very strong card that has a good amount to fit into different places. Next up is the 16th Tarno Regiment. It is a 5-credit, 2 operation cost infantry. It's a 4/7, and it says when you play an intel card, add a legion to the support line and draw a card. So this is the big, expensive top end for a legion deck, and it's a pretty good one. All of your intel cards getting an additional way to draw a card and also adding more legions is just a really solid effect, Like, for example, if we take a look at the Underground State as maybe an example, Underground State goes from Intel 2, bounce a unit, add a legion. It now adds 2 legions and also draws you a card while Tarnow's out on the board. This card supercharges, I think, that practically every Intel card you play. TKS summons a 2/2 and draws a card on top of its Intel 3, all for 1 credit. I think Tarno Regiment is like the top end card and is a must kill immediately or you're going to lose the game type of card. It seems really strong in my opinion, and could very quickly snowballs if you are holding 1 to 2 Intel cards, because it's going to draw you more Intel cards, which means more legions and more buffs because you're playing Intel cards, and it's adding more guards, and it's just very quickly getting out of hand. I think this is a very strong card, and in the Legion deck, this is another one that you're probably going to include because it's really, really good. And now, the final card, the Spitfire Mark V PL. It is a 6 credit, 2 operation cost, 5/6 fighter. It has exile, and it is a British exile, and it says deployment, give a friendly infantry +1/+1 and guard. Sadly, unlike the last 3 cards we've talked about, which I think are all incredibly powerful cards, I think the Spitfire Mark V PL falls short. For Poland, I'm just not seeing it. I can understand, like, Poland does have a lot of infantry, so, you know, maybe you could buff it up while putting out a big fighter, but it's just like, you know, it works with the Spitfire archetype, which I think makes this a much stronger tool. And it makes it a good threat. And I think in the Spitfire deck, this will be ran. But otherwise, I don't see it for Poland. I think there's much better things to be doing in Poland. And the exile card, like, you don't want to be playing this for 5 credits, I don't think, really. And if you're just running it like as a vanilla unit, I think there's a lot of better things to be doing. So sadly, I think this falls a little short. You're not going to run this for a Polish deck, at least not right now. Maybe if exile has more value in the future, it becomes a better option. Or maybe if you really need guards, but otherwise, I don't think this is going to see much use. And with that, that is the nation. So to recap, let's go back to France. France got a potentially new archetype that I hope we see more expansion on. I think France really needs something new to it rather than just more resistance or mobilize stuff. So even though the 4E Brigade is not good, I hope we see more following its footsteps. And then we got Cross of Lorraine, which could be an interesting card in Japan Resistance. And we'll have to see where that goes. The Cannon DA-47 is a very powerful artillery piece. I think it fits well into certain aggressive decks. And I guess we'll see if those decks can make use of it. And then we got Decisive Defense, which I think is just another good Italian control tool. Easy to use and effective. Or not easy to use, but, you know, it's a good way to stop the enemy and is effective at what it does. In Poland, we have a lot of archetypes going on. There's a lot of things going on, and I think there's so many things going on that Poland has to find a place somewhere. Whether that is with legions, whether that is with, like, in an aggro deck, whether that's a survive combat deck. I think there's simply too much going on in too many places for Poland not to have some viable place in the meta. I think the strongest aspect of Poland is the Legions plan. Plan West, the Kards, Underground State, and Tarnow are just really strong cards that I think very quickly that form a good core foundation for it. And then you can supplement it with stuff like First to Fight, TKS, and other ones. I think that is its own package, and I think is definitely going to be a strong ally tool. Legions are just seemingly going to be good on the defense, but also good on the offense. And I think that gives them a big benefit. There's not a lot of decks that run defensive guards that then are able to turn those guards into really serious threats really quickly, especially in the numbers that Legions do. So I think it's going to end up as quite the strong archetype, especially with the nerf to Mare Nostrum that happened a couple days ago. I think it is going to be a very serious contender in something like British Control. But even beyond that, I think the Survive Combat package of like First to Fight, 5th Legion, Stubborn Defense, 7 TP, those I think all have a lot of potential also in some sort of aggressive deck. The first thing I'm going to try with them is a US Polish deck and see where that takes me. But I think that there's maybe even just good enough to run in just aggro decks in general, and you're just playing well-statted units that, are really difficult to trade into, and the enemies just, if they do, you're drawing cards or your units are growing and whatnot. So I think that has a lot of potential also as a good aggressive archetype. And then kind of the final set of stuff are the artillery things, you know, the P7 and the 37 millimeter. There's a good amount of backline decks that could really benefit from these units. So I think maybe Poland has enough there to wiggle its way in with those. And then you also have some exile stuff. I think that's probably the weakest aspect of Poland. But I think that if it gets expanded upon, it'll end up a lot better. And I think most of these cards, most of the exile cards do have a place in other decks. So I think overall, I'm very excited for Poland. I think we're going to see a lot more of Poland in the coming days. And once the expansion fully releases and people get all the cards, I expect Poland to fully find place in at least 1 or 2 decks. I'll be very surprised if we don't see any Poland. I think there's just too much going on with them, and I'm really excited to see an ally nation come out that isn't absolute garbage in the beginning. We saw with France and Italy way back in 2019 with Allegiance that they came out pretty middling. And only with a lot of new releases have they really come into more serious places. So here's hoping that Poland ends up a strong nation. Let me know down in the comments what you think of Poland. Is there a favorite card in Poland or just a favorite card of the set in general? Because we have now concluded our 6-part Legion card review. I know there was quite a lot of stuff to go through, so let me know what you think. Did you enjoy this longer review where I talked about each card, or would you rather prefer something like a shorter review where I, instead of talking about each card individually, instead group them up into packages, you know, and we talk about, you know, oh, I think that like the survive combat for Poland, you know, these 4 cards I think work together in a deck, you know. That would definitely make this a lot shorter. So let me know if you would like to see something like that next time we have an expansion, or if you preferred these sort of longer and more in-depth looks. Beyond that, make sure to like and subscribe. I got a lot of stuff planned for coming up, and we're going to continue the budget starter lists on May 31st because I want to actually include the new Legion content in our fully decked out German deck list. And after that, we're also going to move on to the other nations. And even beyond that, I also have a lot of decks I've been brewing, and I want to share them all with you in videos coming up soon. So there's just a lot of stuff that'll be coming to the channel. So subscribe and comment and like, and make sure not to forget it. Ring that bell. I haven't been mentioning that, but that way you'll get notifications whenever I post an upload. There's a lot of stuff coming. Legions seems exciting. So anyway, that's about it for this video. I've gone on long enough. I want to thank you all for watching, and have a good day.